This has been a long process, and we're here tonight to present a final report from the National Resource Network for our 5-year financial plan. First of all, I want to thank the team from the National Resource Network, David, Ryan, and Danielle. And there's another person I just met tonight, Dean, here tonight. But I appreciate all the work that they put forward with getting this project together. I will remind everyone that this was a grant that we received. It was a $350,000 project. 75% was paid for by the National Resource Network through the Arnold Foundation. We also received $25,000 toward our match from the Danville Regional Foundation. So a majority of the cost of this project has been covered by other sources. And I thank them both for that. What you'll hear tonight is that based on the budget that was adopted recently, we have a 5-year structural budget gap that equals about $22.3 million over the 5-year period if we do nothing different. So in order to close the gap and continue to make investments in Danville's future, there are a number of recommendations that are going to be discussed in broad categories. The broad categories include service reductions, a discussion of employee benefits, and revenue enhancements. And throughout this entire process, we've always talked about there is no sacred cows. So even things that have been discussed before by city councils of the past and decided not to pursue, some of those things might be brought up again. And it's not because we're trying to thumb a nose at anybody. We felt like it was important that all options were on the table so that we can be as transparent as possible about the things that are available for us to do, and that we can decide based on that information what is best for Danville to move us forward. There are 3 points that I want to make sure everybody understands as we go forward. First, we need to agree upon, and I've looked at the data, our finance staff has looked at the data, we feel very comfortable about this, so we feel like this is a fact, that there is a significant long-term structural budget gap that needs to be addressed. Our trend on our revenue is about 1% every year, and our trend on our expenditures is 3 to 4% every year. That is not a sustainable path. We have to do something to address that. Also, I think it's important to note that in order to improve our outlook so that we're not growing at just 1% every year, we have to make investments in Danville's future. So we have to make Danville a more desirable place to live. And without that, we won't have growth, and without growth, we won't improve our tax base. And if we don't improve our tax base, our revenues will not grow. The third thing that is important to keep in mind, and this is actually a very good thing, it's very good that council decided to do this, to pursue this at this time. A lot of communities wait until they're in crisis mode. They've already spent all their fund balance, they're already running out of money, and they have to do something. We're not in that position. We are in a strong financial position. We have a AA- credit rating, which is very good. And what we're doing is attacking this issue by looking into the future and knowing that something has to be done. Now, that doesn't mean that it's going to be easy. There are some tough choices that have to be made. But it should be a credit to the council and to those who have been working on this that we are taking a look at this now rather than waiting until 5 years from now when we're really pressed to do something. And you only have to look at a place like Petersburg, Virginia, to know what could happen if you don't deal with issues that you know are coming up. So that being said, I realize that there are a lot of constituencies that are going to be concerned about the things that are presented. There's a lot of tough options in there. They're going to affect people. Employees are concerned. People who get our services will be concerned. You will be concerned. Everyone is concerned, obviously. But I think it's important to have an honest and full discussion about the options and to make sound choices so that we can move forward into the future and have the ability to make investments in Danville that will produce growth. With that being said, I'd like to turn it over.
Before you do that, would it be better for you all, council, just watch this presentation, listen to the presentation, we have a work session afterwards, and then council ask questions afterwards?
Yes, that would be great. It probably would be preferred to go ahead and run through this presentation as quickly as we can. It will likely take up most of the time during this session, and then pick it up afterwards in the work session for discussion. So if that's acceptable, that'd be great. So with that, I'll turn it over to David with the National Resource Network. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is David Eichenthal. I'm the Executive Director of the National Resource Network. I'm also a Managing Director with PFM, the member of the National Resource Network Consortium that was designated to lead this engagement with the city. I want to start by echoing some of what the city manager said, which is while doing this sort of multi-year planning process for a city's finances is absolutely a best practice, absolutely recommended by the Government Finance Officers Association, it's not something that a lot of cities do. And it's not something that a lot of cities do with the intent and focus that the city, both members of the city council and the administration have brought to this. And I think part of this isn't a surprise to the National Resource Network. When I appeared before council last, one of the things that I said was that the reason we were coming back to Danville was because when we first came here and provided some assistance around the development of the Community Development Corporation, it was clear that while Danville had a bunch of economic challenges, it had leadership that was ready and willing to take on those challenges in a serious way. And we've absolutely seen that again as we've worked on the multi-year plan. I think the final multi-year plan document, the long form, and I know it will be hard to believe as you sit through this presentation, this is the short form. The long form of the presentation is about 165 slides, goes into greater detail than we'll go into tonight, particularly around some of the benchmarking and particularly around some of the background in terms of some of the conditions that led up to the gap that the city manager talked about. But I want to spend the remainder of this time going through this presentation, trying to talk a little bit about the nature of the fiscal challenge, the nature of the economic challenge for Danville, and trying to lay out an approach and a series of recommendations to address these challenges. This is just a brief timeline. As a reminder, the city actually first applied for this assistance in September of last year. We kicked off our work here in Danville in December of 2017. And city manager made reference to this a little bit in his opening remarks. While the plan that's focused exclusively on the city's finances is what I'm presenting here tonight, my partner, Dean Kaplan, who's also here this evening, is leading another team that's working closely with the school system in developing essentially a parallel or complementary plan for the schools. And you'll see, particularly when we talk about some of the issues around the need for investment, how the two pieces of work complement one another and should ultimately be seen as a package. So the background, right? So this is the fiscal challenge that's really before the city and sort of how you got this way. After 3 years in a row, after 2014 to 2016, the city running, in some cases significant, in some cases more modest surpluses on a year-to-year basis. In both 2017 and based on what we saw in the 2018 adopted budget, the city has run recurring deficits in terms of its spending. The FY 2019 adopted budget builds upon that by dipping into fund balance for an additional $3.1 million. So that over this 3-year period of time, the city has spent $15 million more than it's projected to have taken in terms of revenue. And again, you could see that some of the actions that the council took in the adoption of the fiscal 19 budget produced a small improvement in that. So when we were initially looking at this data, and I think I appeared before the council and sort of talked about what the implications of what at that point was the proposed fiscal 19 budget, we were then looking at a slightly greater deficit going into fiscal 19. And that's because council took a number of different steps in adopting the fiscal year 19 budget, both to reduce certain areas of spending and to increase certain revenue. Revenue really around the meals tax rate increase. The reduction in spending was a reduction in the amount of money transferred to the capital fund for investment. Council did also take some steps that result in new and additional spending in terms of public safety retirement benefits. And then the council is now taking steps forward with an initial investment in the new Riverfront Park, which I don't believe has an immediate impact on general fund, but there's an open question in terms of the amount of spending that the city will need to do going forward for the completion of that park. So this is really the gap that the city manager described. So that what you see in this chart is starting with a projected deficit of 3.1 million in FY19, that growing out to projected deficits of 5.3 million in fiscal 22 and fiscal 23. You see a gradual depletion of the city's fund balance from about 25.1 million down to about $6 million by the end of the 5-year plan in fiscal 23, so that there is a cumulative deficit, right? If you sort of add up all those year-to-year deficits over the next 5 years, there is a cumulative deficit of about $22.3 million. Obviously, right? Obviously, if you were to continue this trend line out, really only 1 or maybe 2 more years, you see just how unsustainable this is, because at a certain point, the city runs out of fund balance and is literally running out of money. The city, as I noted, not just as part of the fiscal 19 budget, has taken some steps on the revenue side to address this deficit and address this gap. Both in terms of the increase of the property tax rate, the personal property tax rate, the hotel occupancy tax rate, and as I've already mentioned, the meals tax rate. However, despite these recent actions and some prior actions that we detail in the final plan, as the city manager suggested, you are in the classic case of structural deficit, where simply defined, your expenditures are projected to grow at a greater rate than what your revenue is projected to grow. That's because we see, based on the assumptions that we developed in concert with department heads and others in city administration, year-to-year average growth based on historical trends in tax revenue is below a growth rate in inflation. We see projected annual contributions to the retirement system increasing, projected increases around healthcare costs, a somewhat greater reliance now as sort of your pay-go funding for capital spending has gone down, a greater reliance on debt, which results in debt service, and the use of fund balances to meet certain spending commitments and to focus on economic development. So this is what we characterize to you as something of an urgent challenge. I think, as the city manager pointed out, it's not necessarily a challenge that puts the city in a position of immediate risk of insolvency, puts the city in a position where the only way out is to make draconian cuts tomorrow. We've certainly seen that be the case in other cities where we've done our work. But it is a situation where, in the absence of action, reasonable action over the next 5 years, the city is facing those very, very significant and very real fiscal challenges. I think the other thing that I would say to you, and again, echoing the remarks of the city manager, is, and I think something that I said the last time I appeared before this council, was the goal of city government can't just be a balanced budget, right? You have to have a balanced budget. You have to ultimately act in a fiscally sustainable way over time. But I know of very, very few cities where residents or businesses come and say, well, the reason we're here, the reason we're moving here is solely because the city budget is balanced, right? So in order to promote quality of life in Danville, and really specifically in order to meet some of the very, very clear goals that this council set forth for the city in terms of crime reduction, in terms of improving education, and in terms of growing the local economy, there's a need not just to address this $22 million gap over the next 5 years, but also to ensure that there are resources available to make the sorts of investments that begin to allow for Danville to grow and to prosper. So as city manager noted, there are absolutely recommendations of program cuts here. There are absolutely recommendations of new taxes and other new revenue sources. I think wherever we've done that, and you'll certainly see this in the longer version of the report, we've tried to highlight sort of where Danville stands in comparison to other cities, particularly other cities in Virginia. So we have, I think, worked hard and well in ensuring that any recommendation that we're coming to you with as an option for how to proceed doesn't place Danville out of the mainstream of other benchmark cities that we've compared you to. That benchmarking process is a highlight of this slide around methodology. I will tell you what I always try and tell elected leaders and administrative leaders in a city government when we do go through a benchmarking exercise. I never consider benchmarking dispositive, right? So that I think looking at what other cities do is always helpful to create a context for what your city does. I know when I was in city government, I was always trying to figure out how we compared to other cities, but more often than not, the benchmarking process doesn't dictate an answer to a question. It helps to inform how you approach the question. I think the other critical piece of methodology, particularly when it comes to some of the assumptions that underlie the budget projections, are, as the city manager stated, we went through these assumptions and the outcomes and the results on multiple occasions with the city manager, the finance director, the budget staff, to make sure that we had achieved a consensus approach in looking forward on the forecast, so that there could be, I think, a wide range of helpful debate that you all will have around some of the recommended actions that you could take. But in terms of the nature of the problem, I think between the network team, based on our expertise, and the city and the city's management, there's consensus there. As we develop these initiatives, we took pain to make sure that in every case we were reaching out to relevant department heads. So I think we've had multiple conversations with, if not all of the department heads, certainly most of them, certainly those that would be impacted by some of the recommendations herein. I will tell you that our experience in Danville was dissimilar from what we've seen in other cities in some ways, and similar in other ways. It was dissimilar in a good way. Usually those conversations are very difficult and sometimes on first effort not very productive. The level of cooperation that we received from department heads and having these conversations here in Danville was really exemplary. It was similar in the sense that that level of input helped us decide that there were certain things that initially made sense to us in terms of an option to put on the table, but we were persuaded, not because the department head said, gee, I don't like this idea, but because they came back to us and said, well, look, this may be how this recommendation will look on paper. Let me explain to you what the operational impact would be or what the real fiscal impact would be. So that part of the process was useful. And then finally, the folks who worked on the team, both those who are here today and those who visited in the city, have all worked on these sorts of projects in other cities around the country. I've been in local government in different places around the country. So we bring our experience and expertise and knowledge of best practices in some other places to the consideration of these different recommendations. So what we are presenting in terms of opportunities for reform are a set of about 45 recommended options for the city in going forward. As the city manager discussed, we really see them in different categories. You'll see that we spend a fair amount of time looking at public safety issues in Danville, a certain amount of time looking cross-cutting in city government at workforce-related issues in terms of compensation and benefits. Certain amount of time looking at the operations of those non-public safety departments within city government. A little bit of a look at Danville utilities, and also a look at some options in terms of revenue. And we close, I hope, by trying to lay out what we heard in many cases from folks in this room in terms of what the city is looking for in terms of opportunities for investment going forward. And that really lays out what I just talked about: public safety, workforce, what we call operational efficiency, looking at the utilities, which even though they're a self-sustaining enterprise fund, provide a significant annual contribution to the city's general fund, looking at other revenue sources, and looking at the types of areas where it's been identified to us that there's need for greater investment. So let me start by talking about public safety. Let me start by talking about the city farm. And this is really an area where benchmarking is pretty important. So the reason we looked at the city farm are actually multiple reasons that we looked at the city farm. One, if you look at the incarceration rate, so the number of people on an average day, either in the city farm or the jail or the juvenile detention facility in Danville, and you compare it to other local jurisdictions in Virginia, and you compare it to other local jurisdictions nationally, the Danville incarceration rate is about 5 times the national rate and about 3 times the local rate for Virginia. Danville's also the only local government in Virginia that continues to run its own local detention center, as opposed to housing all, at least adult inmates in a jail facility. We also looked at this area of spending within the general fund, because when you look at the prior 5-year period, 13 through 17, and look at what was happening to spending on this area compared to the rest of the general fund, you'll see that it's an area where the growth rate was 3 times the growth rate for non-public safety general fund spending. And that what we've tried to do, and you'll see this in some of the slides in the book around police and fire as well, is to try and identify the total cost of operations. So the nature of Danville's budget is that there are certain employee benefit costs that are in departmental costs. There are some that are separated out. There are debt service costs that are separated out. So we were trying to look at the true total cost, and compared to other spending by the city, the cost of incarceration overall in Danville is pretty significant. We focused on the adult detention center, by the way, because again, city farm, only of its type among local jurisdictions in Virginia, and also the nature of the funding stream for the city jail in Danville is very much supported by funding from the Commonwealth as a result of the structure that's true for the rest of the state. That's not true for the adult detention center. We also wanted to be careful in looking at the city farm because we understand, and we'll talk more about it later, that crime and violent crime in particular is a real issue here in Danville, and it's an issue that this council has indicated it sees as a priority to address. We look, therefore, to try and understand who is in the adult detention center. And you can see some of the data up there. These are mostly folks who, majority of whom are there because of revocation of probation. Most of the charges where probation was revoked was for a non-violent offense. So we have a major recommendation related to the city farm, and then what I would call a sub-recommendation, which I'll get to at the end of the section on public safety. The major recommendation, and we've had a conversation with the sheriff, we've had conversations with the folks who lead the adult detention center, and with the new police chief and the city manager and the compensation board, is that the city should seriously explore transitioning control and operation of the adult detention center from the police department to the sheriff. Now, we believe that there's a real possibility that the Commonwealth, through the compensation board and through legislative action, would, as a result of this, pick up a significant amount of the cost of operating the adult detention center. That's not a guarantee. And it's not only not a guarantee, it's something that will require a real amount of transition planning. So, and you'll see it in this case, you'll see it throughout. We're saying to you that if you started this process today, you would not realize any savings in fiscal 19, right? But if you don't start this process today, you won't see any savings in fiscal 20. So our recommendation is that the city look to start this process, begin conversations with the legislative delegation, begin the transition planning that would be necessary for this to work. We also looked at the Danville Police Department, focusing on basically the parts of Danville PD other than the juvenile detention facility and the adult detention center. And again, if you sort of compare the growth in spending in the DPD over the last 5-year period to non-public safety general fund spending, you can see DPD is about 3 to 3.5 times the rate of growth in these other areas. And that the police department budget, at least in fiscal 18, when you figured in total cost, was about $10.8 million. This, I think, goes to, again, some of the nuance around benchmarking. So if you look at the number of police FTEs per 100,000 residents, if you look at the number of sworn officers per 100,000 residents in Danville, you'll see that through that benchmarking exercise, Danville far exceeds the average for the other benchmark cities. But while it exceeds it on that measure of benchmarking, the picture is basically flipped when you compare the number of police FTEs or sworn officers based on violent crime, right? So we're very sensitive to the fact that any potential reductions that may exist within the police department have to be weighed against the need to address the crime and violent crime issues here in Danville. One area where we spent some time and some focus was on the notion of span of control. And I will tell you that this is actually very consistent with an area of focus for your new chief. So that the new chief has already recognized the need to flatten the police organization by reassigning the deployment of captains from responsibility over shifts to responsibility over geographic areas. We spent a lot of time with the chief talking through whether there are other opportunities to basically flatten the organization in a way that would not have a negative impact on the police department's ability to respond to crime and particularly to violent crime. We identified 9 positions, none of them, by the way, at the patrol level, where there were opportunities for eventual elimination of these positions. And again, some of these positions can be eliminated in the short term through attrition. It would be a gradual process over the next 5 years, but the savings would be significant. We went through a similar process of evaluation of staffing within the Danville Fire Department, right? Because again, we're looking, if you sort of think about it, right? Schools, around 21 million in spending, incarceration around 10 million, police around 10 million, fire a little under 10 million. I often tell people who say, well, why do you focus on these areas? I sometimes say that we try to apply what I call the Willie Sutton theory of budgeting. You'll recall that Willie Sutton was famously asked why he robbed banks, and the answer was because that's where the money is. In Danville, like most other cities, really like most other county level jurisdictions, there's typically a significant amount of general fund spending when you look at it on a departmental basis are in these sort of public safety or criminal justice functions. Danville is a little bit of a different story in terms of growth rates and spending, much closer in terms of growth rate to the rest of the non-public safety general fund spending growth of about 5.6%. But there's now a very useful tool for benchmarking around fire departments. The NFPA, National Fire Protection Association, regularly cited by fire departments around the nation, actually did a survey of every fire department in the United States in 2017, really the first time that this happened. And they do not, they're very careful, and I will be very careful as well to say that these are not the recommended levels of staffing, but these are the levels of staffing. So if you look nationally at career fire departments in cities roughly the size of Danville, there's about one career firefighter for every 1,000 residents. In the South, that goes up to about 1.6 firefighters for every 1,000 residents. If you applied that median for the South to Danville, there would be 70 sworn firefighters. Danville currently has 120 sworn firefighter positions. Similarly, if you look at the NFPA data, you see that about a quarter of the departments serving jurisdictions from 25,000 to 50,000 residents are mostly or all volunteers, and that these same communities had an average of 0.095 stations per 1,000 residents. If you applied this to Danville, Danville would have 4 fire stations. Now, we did a similar analysis focused on some of those same benchmark Virginia cities around the size of the fire department. Again, Danville had about 290 FTEs per 100,000 residents compared to about 213 for benchmark cities. But when you factor in the number of calls that the departments were handling, again, it flips around in terms of the benchmarking process. That's why, by the way, and it's not fully detailed here, work that's already going on in Danville is incredibly important to addressing some of these efficiency issues within the fire department, and that goes to driving down some of the demand for service. So we heard from the chief, and this was a great example where the department came back to us and said, you need to understand what's going on a little bit better in Danville, where Danville has recently started, I think it kicked off in May, with an initiative around community paramedicine that the department's participating in, but I believe the life-saving crew is also really taking the lead. The idea is pretty simple. A relatively small number of people are dependent upon some of the 911 related services. To the extent that you could drive down utilization by that relatively small number of frequent users and divert them to other less costly ways of addressing some of their issues, it could improve their health, and oh, by the way, it could improve the fiscal health of the city. So that's a process that's going forward, and I think that's a process that has real potential import for the city over the next 5 years. Nevertheless, when you look at the number of fire stations and the number of firefighters that Danville has, we think that it's only prudent to put on the table what would happen if the city looked to potentially eliminate one of its stations. Now, we're not going to tell you which one to look at eliminating. And we actually bake into the plan the fact that you would need to spend some money focused on that approach to make sure that whatever the city did in consolidating or eliminating a station, it took into full account what the safety implications were. But what we can tell you is that the number of calls, particularly the number of fire calls, vary greatly from station to station. So that demand function that I was talking about is actually pretty important. And we know, and when we look at fire departments, we always hear about the concern about what about our ISO rating? And Danville, of course, is in the top 2%, I think, among cities with an ISO rating of 1. There are absolutely cases where locations that have gone from an ISO of 5 to an ISO of 7 or 9 have had an impact on some insurance costs. There's no research out there that says if you go from 1 to 2 or 1 to 3 that there's any impact on insurance costs whatsoever. Some insurers, by the way, don't factor in ISO ratings as part of the insurance package at all. There are a couple of other areas in public safety where we do think that there are other opportunities for savings. We talked about the city farm. Even if there is a shift over from the police department to the sheriff in terms of the operation of the adult detention center, there would be continuing costs to the city. We think that the city could get a lot of what it currently gets out of the city farm right now by moving in a direction that lots of other cities in Virginia, lots and lots of other cities and jurisdictions around the country have moved to, which is reducing the actual number of folks who are incarcerated, who are in custody, who are being fed, who are receiving medical care, and instead move to a greater utilization of community service sentencing. We also think that there are some additional savings available within the Danville Police Department. The Chief and I spent some time talking about this. There has been a relatively recent surge in police overtime spending. That surge should be more controllable over the next few years, and we think there are savings opportunities there as well. Short of closing a fire station, or potentially in addition to it, we think that there's the ability to eliminate current FTEs in the fire department who are assigned to fill in for Kelly shifts. Now, I want to be very clear about this. Eliminating 9 firefighter positions, which we'd only suggest looking at from an attrition perspective, would yield more than $1 million, would yield more than, in terms of cumulative savings, than $1 million, but there would probably be a need to do overtime to backfill the loss of some of those positions. Overtime doesn't always make sense, but overtime in this sort of situation can actually be less costly than having full-time employees. And the last recommendation in this public safety area goes to the matching payment that the city makes for foster care services, which are largely funded through state funding. We detail in the full deck how we think some changes in the way that decisions are made to have kids go into foster care, particularly when they're related to truancy, may both yield a better outcome for the kids and cost less for the city. We also talk in the full deck about a model initiative in this direction that took place in Norfolk over the last couple of years, where they've seen real success. Let me talk about compensation and benefits. So, again, this is, in a sense, the essence of the challenge. Your compensation is growing at a faster rate than your revenue. In the long term, I will tell you, and I think this, again, reflects some of the remarks that the city manager made early on, The best way to fix this problem is to build up the tax base, have investments, have the city thrive economically. So in a way, the trick to all of this is to figure out how to manage down these structural gaps in the short term by providing enough funding for investments that begin to grow revenue in the out years for the city. And just as public safety is so key to looking at opportunities for savings reduction, when you look at it less about departments and more about categories of overall spending, compensation, salary, and benefits is incredibly important, because that's, again, where the city just spends a lot of money. Now, I want to say this as clearly as I can to the point of belaboring the issue. I'm going to lay out a series of recommendations and options in this area. We do not recommend that you adopt all of these recommendations, because what we're going to talk about are how do you curb the growth in wages, how do you curb the growth in benefits, how do you get employees to pay more for their own health care and for their own benefits. Now, if you tried to add all of this up and did all of these things, you would save a significant amount of money, but you would also have a direct hit impact on your employees that would have negative consequences. We think that the right way to think about these recommendations is to figure out what combination of them can begin to significantly help you in the short term in curbing cost, but to do it in a way that's manageable. One approach that we've talked about that's worked in other places is the notion of gain sharing. So if you're going to continue to see your overall compensation costs driven up by benefit costs, by healthcare costs, that limits your ability to do what the city regularly does, which is a 2% increase in the amount of funding for wages. So maybe you do things on the benefit and health side so that you could continue to keep pace on salary compensation. You could do the flip side. You could make a decision that, well, we really don't want to do anything, or we don't think we can do anything on the benefit side, but ultimately that means that you can't do 2% per year. And you'll see what the impacts are in a second, and you'll see why this is so important. So, is it common to have a wage freeze across a 5-year period of time in a city government? No. Is it something that cities have had to resort to if they're in extremely difficult fiscal distress? Absolutely. There are cities that have not just had a wage freeze, there are cities that have had furloughs, there are cities that have had non-attrition reduction in workforce, otherwise known as layoffs, which we haven't talked about in this presentation. Think of it this way. If all that you did was to implement a citywide wage freeze for a 5-year period of time, that would produce $9.9 million in savings, which helps you get halfway in terms of closing the structural gap. By the way, it doesn't do anything to free up funding available for investment. Because of the way that growth compounds, and because of the way that there's at least some reimbursement for the Commonwealth on some certain salaries, capping wage growth at 1% annually would generate about $5.9 million in savings over the course of the plan. There's also an issue related to employee compensation. So since March of 1979, employee contributions for ERS have been paid for the city, and contributions for employees hired after September of 1991 are considered to be 100% city contributions. So the total contributions to the pension plan for the year ending in June of 2017 amounted to about 2.9 million, of which were really about $500,000 were really these payments that the city made, but the city made on behalf of employees. This is where benchmarking comes in handy. No one else does this. So most benchmarks are in the VRS system, which requires a 5% employee contribution. That's not true in Roanoke, but Roanoke still requires employees to contribute 5% of salary. If the city moved to phase this in, right, and you could see in some detail how we project the phase in, requiring this 5% employee contribution to ERS over time would generate about $5.8 million in savings for the city over the period of the plan. There are also a series of recommendations that we lay out as options that go to issues around healthcare, because remember, healthcare premiums, the cost of claims is an area where there's been steady growth. So some of this looks to how the city spreads share of costs, particularly when there are employees that may have access to other health benefit plans. And you'll see in the long-form version of the document other places that have basically incentivized the waiving of city coverage. Some of it could be through what's referred to as a spousal carve-out or buy-up program. You see significant savings there. Some of this is focused on conducting a dependent eligibility verification audit to see whether family members, others that are still on the plan, should be on the plan. And the final recommendation, again, goes to this same notion around that I just talked about in terms of retirement benefits, which is what's the split between who bears the cost for the benefit. So a number of cities have moved toward a model where roughly 30% of the cost of health insurance is covered by the employee. Again, let me just go back. Again, if you added up all of these different initiatives, right? So if you add this up, this gets you to about 8.9 million. This adds another 5.8 million. So you're talking around 14.7 million. And then you've got the potential of a citywide wage freeze and citywide wage growth cap of 1%. I want to be really clear. Don't add it up, right? This is a menu of options that we think, all of which we think on their own merit consideration, but we think it's incredibly important that the city weigh the cumulative impact that this has on its workforce. We also looked, and you'll see much greater detail in the long form of the report than in this short presentation. We did not just look at public safety, right? So we looked across the other departments within city government as well. I'll tell you a couple of things. One, a number of recommendations that came out of the operational efficiency study that was done, I believe, 2011. Were adopted, are still in place, have sort of positioned the city in terms of best practice and level of staffing. That's one thing. Second thing that I would say is that, again, even where there are opportunities in these non-public safety areas, just because the base amount that's being spent in those areas is relatively lower than in police or fire or JDF or ADC or the city jail, the opportunities for savings are lower, right? I am familiar with elected officials, and I'm not suggesting that anyone here would ever say this. I am familiar with elected officials who sometimes say, we've got to close the deficit, just don't do anything to police, fire, employees, or taxes. And I said to the city manager and said to the advisory group that he had pulled together to help us in this process, I don't know many places where that's really a viable option, because if you put all of that together, your options are limited. They're not non-existent, but they're limited. So let me say that about this area as well. We did do some of the same sort of benchmarking around non-public safety areas that we did for public safety. And what we found was, generally speaking, the sort of FTE per capita gap that we saw in some cases around public safety did not exist in the non-public safety functions. There were two areas where they did exist, and that's why we focused on them in our recommendations. One is around Parks and Recreation, and one is around Public Works. On Parks and Recreation, though, part of this is driven by a decision that the city made that places it as a bit of an outlier when compared to some of the other benchmarks. Most of the other benchmarks that we looked at don't have their own library system. So they're part of a regional library. And that explains a chunk of the difference in terms, and we looked at the number of FTEs per capita. We think that there are some things that Danville should consider in reviewing the library system. We think one thing may be that we know you have two branches. Our understanding is that the main branch is more utilized than the Westover branch, certainly more utilized by city residents than the Westover branch. It may be time to reevaluate whether there's an opportunity to consolidate to a single branch. I think what might make even more sense is to whether or not libraries are the first of many areas where there may be opportunities for shared services. Similar story when it comes to the airport, right? We understand the economic value of having an airport. It's not very well utilized. It does have a direct impact on the general fund. There are issues in terms of the ability to just end operation of the airport because of the level of grants from the FAA, but we think that this is really an area where there's an opportunity for savings, either by seeking regional sources of funding for it, by looking at operation by a third party, or ultimately by doing the math about what a phase out of the airport would look like as without putting at risk some of the federal dollars that have been put into it already. When we talk about public works, what we tend to look at, and I should be very clear about this, what we did not do in looking at public works, for example, is look at the level of service that's provided in return for the amount of staff and the amount of funding that goes into these individual areas. We looked at an FTE per capita, again, much the same way we did with public safety. Part of the explanation for the difference in public works may be attributable to the fact that some of these other cities rely more on outside contractors to do certain functions that are currently carried out in Danville by city employees. We think that's an option. I mean, I think you'll almost never hear us recommend you should just contract this out. We more often than not say that the best course is to look at whether there's a managed competition process where you could really have the public sector and private sector competitors compete against one another for price and quality of service and see what would happen. We think in the vast majority of cases in other cities, that frequently results in the public sector winning, but perhaps winning with a better operational model. We think that the areas where, if you applied managed competition in Danville, the areas of greatest opportunity in terms of savings would really be around some of the facility maintenance and custodial services. I'll tell you though, and we'll talk more about schools in a little bit, part of what we're doing in the schools plan that's being developed is to dig deeper to identify whether there are those services or other services where a shared service model between the school district and the city could produce some savings for both. We also identify in the full report some areas where there may be departmental reorganization opportunities, again, particularly around parks and recreation, just based on looking at span of control. Let me talk about the utilities. We looked at Danville Utilities from a number of different perspectives and for a number of different reasons. Again, remember benchmarking, informative, not dispositive. I think we've highlighted in other presentations that Danville, I believe, is the only local municipality in the Commonwealth to basically have all of the different utilities as public utilities. I think we're also incredibly sensitive to some of the things that we heard about rates in Danville. We spent a fair amount of time, not just with some of the members of the team who members of council and department heads have met, but actually brought in some other expertise around utility operation to revisit issues that I know that the city has looked at in the past in terms of whether or not there's an ability to sell some of the utilities. Wouldn't that be an option? I think where we came down, however, was that given where the city is, where Danville Utilities are right now, because in particular because of the existing contract related to power from Prairie State, options that might be on the table in other cases are more limited here in Danville. Let me tell you what we did do, though, which is to go back and even though we looked at the utility funds, the principal focus and sort of the deficit that we articulated at the beginning is around the general fund. And we thought that there was a need to look at the utilities, if for no other reason, because that they were such a significant contributor of revenue. And we went back and looked at the formula. And the way and structure of the formula is such that if you go back and sort of look at some of this in hindsight and look at what the possible levels of contribution were from 2014 to 2018 and what the actual contributions were, there's about a $2.8 million gap, right? So under the full possibility under the existing transfer formula, the city would have received an additional $2.8 million in that period. And the reality is that the utilities are in a position financially where they can afford it, right? Because what we also did was to look at both their financial policies and the recommendations in terms of unrestricted cash balance and where the utilities are right now. And there's room there, right? There's room to kind of go back and recoup some of that $2.8 million. We'll talk a little bit later about some ideas that we have as to how that might be used in the investment section. Let me talk about opportunities for increased revenue. I guess I almost feel like I should take a break and say I don't know that the easy part is coming. For those of you who are waiting for the easy part. I think all of these, as the city manager suggested, are tough choices, but they are choices, and they are options that the city has in terms of going forward. So our general approach, consistent with what the city manager talked about as, and what we frequently refer to as sort of a no sacred cows approach, is to put everything on the table, right? So revenue is absolutely on the table for us. But we also heard, and we heard this quite honestly from some members of council, some people in the community, just generally, that there's a perception that Danville is taxed higher than others around the Commonwealth and in the region. So we went through an analysis that we've done in a couple of places that's somewhat different from, I guess, what's a more typical analysis, which is, let me look at all the rates in all the other places, let me look at our rates, how do we compare? We went through sort of a tax burden analysis. And the idea is, let's look at a bunch of different communities in Virginia, actually the same benchmark communities that we looked at earlier in terms of levels of staffing and service. And let's see what the typical family winds up paying in terms of overall taxes in that particular community, right? And I'll admit to you, this is very much a residential focus. The methodology, by the way, that we use is a methodology that the City Finance Department and the District of Columbia has been using for years now. It's widely cited. It's a very long, very interesting, at least to people like me, report. And it's a methodology that we've applied in a number of different places. So here's the bottom line. So if you take a household earning the median household income in each of the different peer jurisdictions that we looked at, and you'll see the peer jurisdictions and sort of the detail behind this data in the full book. A Danville household earning median income pays about $900 less annually than in other peer communities. And this is not driven by differences, or at least not primarily driven by differences in income, right? So you go, well, our median household income is a lot lower than it is in some of the other peer communities that we looked at. When you take that out, instead of it being the tax burden being 34% less, it's about 28% less. So again, so what does this tell me? I should raise taxes by 28%. No, doesn't say that. But to the extent that people are rightfully concerned about being competitive in terms of tax rate, it should inform decision makers about the context for making decisions about revenue. We also did the analysis that I just talked about, which is, what if you look at rates? So we looked at a bunch of different local jurisdictions on the real estate tax rate. And again, with all the caveats around it that different places may apply different rates in slightly different ways. And by the way, this does not address the question of what in terms of services individual taxpayers are receiving for this. But again, this benchmarking analysis shows that when you compare Danville to some of the other local jurisdictions that we've looked at for other benchmarking reasons, the real estate tax rate is significantly lower. And going from 80 cents to $1, which would still put Danville below Martinsville, Lynchburg, Roanoke, Petersburg, and Manassas, would generate a significant amount of revenue on an annual basis. And we're not even talking about this in the context of fiscal 19 at this point. We know you've just gone through that budget process. But again, this is a path, or part of a path, to both closing the structural deficit and providing enough resources to begin to make some of the investments we'll talk about. There's a similar opportunity, we think, around further increases in terms of personal property tax, though you're already more in the midpoint there. There's less room to sort of grow, we would argue, from a competitive purpose, and the dollars involved are less than what we just saw in terms of the real estate tax. Also, again, just be careful what gets taxed in terms of personal property tax and how it gets taxed from jurisdiction to jurisdiction could lead to some misinterpretation of the data. And in fact, one of the things that we talk about goes to the issue of whether there are things that are currently not taxed in Danville that are taxed in other jurisdictions as another potential way of generating additional revenue. Then the final piece that we would talk about, and we've been really working these numbers to the end of the day, is the imposition of a local tax on cigarettes. And we think that that would generate somewhere over $500,000. Again, every one of the comparator jurisdictions has a tax, with the exception of Pennsylvania County, and our understanding is that the county without specific legislation can't have a tax. So, I go back to where I think we started with respect to the plan, and that's that the goal of what we've tried to lay out for you in terms of options is not to just close that $22 million gap that we identified at the beginning of this presentation. I think you've seen, even though you can't do all of these things at the same time, and we certainly wouldn't recommend that you do all of these things at the same time, we generally try and come back when we do this sort of multi-year planning process by not putting you in the position of saying you have a $22 million problem and we've given you $15 million of solutions. We've tried to tell you that you have a $22 million problem and you have a range of solutions, all of which together would be $70 million. But I would say to you again that what we've seen in city after city, particularly cities like Danville, that are trying to come back from some real economic challenges, is that you look at this as not just an opportunity to balance your budget in a sustainable way over a period of time, but also to have funding available to invest in the future. And what we've categorized is sort of a Danville Future Fund, with the idea that depending on the decisions that you make in terms of revenue and in terms of potential savings, it could both close the baseline gap that we've talked about and free up those resources. And then the question is, well, where would those resources go? And we kind of go back to what we heard from you, what we heard quite honestly before we ever got on the ground, which was that in the context of the budget process, you all said, we care a lot about our schools, and we know we've got to do some more there. We care a lot about reducing violent crime, and we want to do some more there. And we care about doing things that build upon our economy in a way to create opportunity for people who live here and businesses that operate here. To put some of this in context, where we are right now in Danville, even after you all have made a really significant in FY 2018 increase in funding for the school system, again, it's not dispositive, but it's informative. If you look at levels of local school funding per pupil across some of these comparators, you're kind of at the low end of the middle, and you're below the average. To get to the average, you'd need to be spending another $4.2 million or so a year, right? So without any increase over time, that's another, depending on if you're looking at starting in 20, over the course of this plan, that's another $20 million or so to get to the median in public school funding. That doesn't begin to address some of the conversation that we've heard, and that the team that's now focused on Danville Public Schools is certainly going to hear more about and be able to come back with some ideas and recommendations about the need for potential additional investment in capital, right, in the capital costs of the school system. But as I said, our hope is that we're not only able to give you a clearer picture about what those needs are, but we're also in a position to give you a clearer picture of what some of the school system's other needs are in terms of additional funding, and see if there are opportunities for savings that would benefit both the city and the school system fiscally. Let me talk about crime. So typically when we go into communities that have high crime rates, there are 4 components of crime reduction: policing, prosecution, punishment, and prevention. We've already talked about how much Danville spends on policing. We've already talked about how much Danville spends on punishment. What we've noticed is that there's a limited investment right now in prevention. And the implementation of the comprehensive gang model is a step in that direction, but it's one step. Our recommendation is that if the city decides to pursue some of the recommendations related to the city farm, that it be done in the context of a comprehensive crime reduction plan that focuses across all 4 of those P's, with the recognition that whether it's through investments in technology or prevention, there may be investments that have a higher ROI, or a higher return on investment than just keeping the current level of the police department. So it's not a suggestion that the city spend less on reducing crime, but to rethink how some of that spending occurs in a way that hopefully produces a better result. In terms of economic development, and I'm going to try and wrap up in the next 2 minutes so that you all can go to your 7 o'clock meeting. We think that there's an opportunity to better align some of what the city's doing on economic development with some of the regional strategies that are part of the Go Virginia initiative. We also think that any sort of investment in economic development requires an adequate level of investment in the city's capital plan. And you know that part of the way that the city has been able to reduce its reliance on fund balance in the past year was by reducing the amount of money going into capital. That probably needs to be addressed as you all go forward. And that's capital, whether it's capital investments in the purchase and acquisition of sites for future development, or doing something about the fact that your police department is in the basement of this building. And a number of other initiatives that have been outlined that would have a capital impact. The last thing I want to talk about is what I said that I would go back to when we were talking about utilities, which is we think that there's an opportunity with that $2.7 or $2.8 million that has sort of built up over the last 5 years to make an investment in an initiative that potentially reduces costs to some of the residents and businesses within Danville, creates jobs, and potentially increases the value of property. And that's by focusing around investments in energy efficiency. Virginia recently became one of 34 states nationally to have the ability to go forward with a PACE program. I believe both Arlington County and Loudoun County have moved forward with variations of that. We think there's an opportunity to do that here in Danville as well. Again, with a focus not just on immediate job creation through jobs identified to increase efficiency, but long-term economic competitiveness. And with that, let me turn it back to the city manager.
I know that we're going to be in a hurry to get over to the next room, but everyone probably wants to know what do we do next? We have this information, how do we proceed? I know you're aware because I sent you an email today that I'm setting up meetings with employees. You know, we talked a lot about, or David talked a lot about some things up here that could affect employees. So I'm having a supervisor meeting next Thursday to go over this plan with everyone, offer them an opportunity to ask me questions. After that, I plan to have 2 days or a day and a half of drop-in sessions where any employee in the city can come talk to me about their questions or concerns about this. I'm going to address them as best as I can. I want to be as transparent as I possibly can with this process, with the information I have, so that the employees are not fearful about the future, their future status, and all that. I think it's important to be concerned about employee morale, especially when we're talking about stuff like this. In addition to that, we'll likely need to be prioritizing what the city council looks at as far as these options are, what you want me to look at first. We can't look at everything all at the same time and expect to be very good at it. So I'd like to talk about what do you want me to focus in on so that I can bring those recommendations back to you and how that could affect our overall structural gap. Also, I think it's important as we go forward and we start to get some clarity on what we're going to do. I plan to go out into the community and have conversations mostly in a somewhat informal way. I don't think a town hall kind of approach where I have a meeting here at City Hall and invite people to come in. Typically, they don't really generate a whole lot of interest, but if I can go to where people are and talk to them about this and talk about what council's been discussing, that could help the community understand what we're doing and offer them an opportunity to ask questions, voice their concerns, voice their opinions about what's going on. I think there's a lot of information here. There's a lot to digest. A lot, depending on what's done, the service delivery will look different later than what it looks like now, and it really deserves a robust conversation among council members, staff members, and the community to decide what to go forward. But I'll go back to what I said before. One, we need to recognize that there is a gap and it needs to be addressed. I mean, if that's a baseline, we need to go forward agreeing with that fact. Second, like I said before, we need to, and David has reiterated many times, we need to be able to invest in Danville's future if we're going to expect to have any sustainable revenue to go forward and continue to provide services without having to worry about what we're going to cut or what we're going to raise year after year. And then third, we also need to make sure everyone is aware of the fact that we are not waiting until we're in crisis mode to figure out how to deal with this issue. We have taken a proactive approach, which is unique, I think, to a lot of communities. Most places wouldn't say, look into 5 years in the future and say, what do we need to do now to help us with what it's going to look like 5 years from now? Most wait until there's a major problem and there's a crisis and now we have to deal with it. And that's just not the best practice. It's not really what I would recommend. I don't think that makes a lot of sense for Danville, and it takes away all sorts of opportunity for us to invest in the future. We're going to pick this up after the council meeting to get into more depth and hear back from you, because I know you have lots of questions and concerns. This team will be here to talk a little bit, to answer those questions as well. And I appreciate your taking the time to listen to what we had to say.